Ben Hodges is a retired United States Army officer who became commander of the United States Army Europe in November 2014 and held that position for 3 years until retiring from the United States Army in January 2018. He was most recently a senior advisor to Human Rights First until the summer of this year and serves currently as NATO Senior Mentor for Logistics. Until recently, he was the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, specialising in NATO, the transatlantic relationship, and international security. I could add a lot more to that, but we're going to be diving into the questions just shortly. Before we do, please, I'd like to remind you to like and subscribe to the channel to see more fantastic speakers and great content. And please check that you are still subscribed, as many YouTubers who are covering the war in Ukraine have been reporting losing subscribers in a way that's a little unexplained, perhaps part of some algorithmic change or process. And of course, we'd hate for you to miss out on some of the great interviews that we've got lined up. Please also consider becoming a patron to support the work of the channel, or buy me a coffee. And of course, do get involved in activism and supporting Ukrainian charities. And we have a number of videos that analyze which ones are to be trusted and how you should be careful when making donations. Ben, I'm absolutely delighted and privileged to welcome you back to the channel. This is now our 5th in-depth conversation, and in some ways it may prove to be one of the more difficult ones.
Well, obviously, I always appreciate the opportunity, Jonathan, to talk in some depth and detail about these issues, and I wouldn't do it if it wasn't difficult. So I look forward to this.
Let's jump in perhaps with what is one of the trickiest conversations and has maybe several interpretations. Is it now clear that we are placing limits on the scale and severity of Russia's defeat, and thereby we are also placing limits on the scale and rapidity of a potential Ukrainian victory?
I think that's exactly what has happened, unfortunately, because of the unwillingness of the U.S. administration, the German government, and some others to commit publicly as a policy statement that we want to see Ukraine win, to eject Russia back to the 1991 borders. And then the other things that would follow, such as getting the thousands of young Ukrainian children back from Russia, back home into Ukraine, accountability for Russian war crimes, and so on. Of course, what the president says, and with strong bipartisan support from Congress, we have done a lot for Ukraine, as have more than 50 other nations. But the fact that they stopped short of saying it's our policy, it's in our best interest that Ukraine is successful and wins, we therefore do indirectly put limits on what can happen next.
And of course, if we are being partisan, people could say that actually there's no plan, and those limits don't really have a strategy behind them. I would perhaps credit our leaders with far more sort of thought than that. But that's actually in some ways even more worrying. It suggests that it's actually a strategic decision to limit Russian defeat, to limit its collapse. And another narrative that has recently come up is the idea that we are doing this to prevent Russia from becoming a vassal state of China. Now, you could argue that that ship has already sailed and it's full steam towards becoming that status. But do you think there is strategic design behind pulling our punches that we seem to be doing?
Yes, but I don't think that there is a clearly defined strategic plan. In the U.S., you hear calls from Congress, criticisms from members of both parties of the administration for not having clearly defined the objective or having a plan. So you have to infer from actions and inactions and statements and non-statements what the plan is. And it seems to me that the plan from the administration is to make sure that Ukraine does not lose, but that the Russian Federation government does not collapse, and that this does not somehow turn into a nuclear conflict. I've never heard somebody say that the U.S. is concerned that Russia might become a vassal state of China, but there's no doubt that China's interests and China's reactions are part of this calculation. I think that the Chinese are not interested in seeing a collapse of the Russian Federation yet, not because they care about the Russian Federation, but because I think the Chinese do not want a disruption of their access to cheap oil and gas. The Chinese are, of course, looking at the very large part of Russia that used to be China and all of its resources. And then the Chinese, of course, are looking at the Arctic and the increasing ease with which ships will be able to sail through the Arctic in coming years. It's only going to get better for them. So they're more interested, I think, in a sort of a continuity in Russia, but they would not be against the eventual collapse or crumbling of the Russian Federation for all those reasons. And of course, one authoritarian government does not want to see another one, its vulnerability is exposed. I think that's part of it. But from the U.S. side, I think this is an overstated or exaggerated concern that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. Of course, they have to take that serious, but I think we have shown publicly so much concern about that we never did during the Cold War, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We didn't talk about how terrified we were that Russia might use a nuclear weapon. And I think that's a very bad signal to send to Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, others who have or want to have a nuclear weapon.
You've been a strong advocate for sending certain classes of munition to give Ukraine more capabilities. And of course, we've talked on the previous two videos about ATACMS. Finally, they have, they're in the theater, not necessarily in the quantities that are required to move the dial. But what's your impression of the effectiveness with which they've deployed so far? And are you at all surprised the fact that this apparently was such a huge red line? This was such a break point for Russia, the deployment of these, and yet we see the strike on the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. We see the Russian fleet being essentially rendered ineffective within the Black Sea arena, and yet all mention of the red lines seem to have dropped. There seem to be no consequences.
Yeah, these are self-imposed red lines, and we continue to self-deter. And for now 20 months, every month there's like a new thing, a new red line that we declared or assumed is crossed, and nothing happens. And you've touched on the one that was the most that some people were wetting themselves, worried that, oh my God, if Crimea falls or looks so vulnerable, that's a red line for the Russians. And instead, it's apparently a red line for the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, who is now having to relocate exactly as many people predicted, because their vulnerability has been exposed by the use of British-provided Storm Shadow long-range precision weapons. Now, I'm glad that the U.S. finally felt that it could provide a version of ATACMS, but unfortunately, we still half-step by providing the variant that is a cluster munition, which is good, but it has a much shorter range. The one that would make a significant impact on Crimea becoming untenable for Russian forces, of course, is the 300-kilometer range unitary round that would have the effect on Russian Navy facilities and Russian Air Force facilities and Russian logistics in Crimea, the way that we saw from Storm Shadow hitting the dry dock in Sevastopol and the headquarters. What has been employed achieved good effect. It destroyed quite a few of these very expensive Russian attack helicopters. The cluster munitions are good for that, but the range is not the same. So to me, the key is not so much what's on the tin, but it's the capability that's needed. Can they make Crimea untenable for Russian forces, whatever that is? And there are a lot of different weapons that would do that. We have to commit to that.
Now, there's been a lot of mention as well about the German Taurus missile system. What, in your view, is the strategic importance of that, and why is Germany still on the fence about providing that when it's quite clear that Russia will not respond and cannot respond if they were provided?
So the Taurus would be an excellent addition to the let's say, the suite of long-range precision strike capabilities that Ukraine could use to make Crimea untenable, but could also go after Russian logistics and artillery and headquarters that are necessary for Russia's strong linear defenses. I mean, that's how you neutralize the only Russian advantage of mass is by taking out headquarters, logistics, and artillery. So adding to Ukraine's capability to do that would not only have the effect of making Crimea untenable, it would also weaken these defenses that have been so difficult for Ukrainian land forces to penetrate. Why doesn't Germany do it? Well, first of all, they're able to hide behind the United States because the U.S. has not really committed to that same capability, and so that prevents or that enables the German Bundeskanzler to avoid having to make that, to cross that threshold. Secondly, I hear multiple excuses coming out of Berlin about why they can't or don't want to do it. That reminds me of the excuses the U.S. has used, and that's what they are. They're excuses, not compelling reasons, because they don't want to do this. Why is that? I think that the Bundeskanzler, Chancellor Scholz, is very concerned that if they provided Taurus, that they might have to have, he's convinced you would have to have German technicians on the ground actually being part of this, which is not true. The Ukrainians would be able to figure this out, or they could be taught how to do this. You don't have to have a German-speaking technician to do this, but that's one of the excuses. But I think the Bundeskanzler is convinced that that's the case, and that they could, in fact, Germany end up being drawn into a direct conflict with Russia. And what he's concerned about when confronted with the fact, well, look, France and Germany have both provided Storm Shadow and Scalp, they've overcome their concerns. The German Bundeskanzler would say, yes, but they have nuclear weapons. France and UK have a nuclear deterrent of their own. Germany, of course, does not. And if there's a Trump administration next year, and with Trump's constant talk about not protecting other countries, pulling out of NATO, Germany might be exposed. Now, I think this is a really an exaggeration of the possibilities of what happened, but I think that's part of the reason that the German Bundeskanzler is unwilling to take that next step.
Now, this week has seen the publication of two, I think, very important articles for the debate. I'm going to characterize them quite differently, and that may cause some consternation. The first one to cover is the article by General Zaluzhny, a very tough article, which essentially characterizes the position at the moment as stalemate. That's something that we have tried not to do, certainly on this channel, but hearing it from a credible source like Zaluzhny has to be taken incredibly seriously. But he's articulated quite an interesting nuance, and that is the use of drone warfare has created a sort of strategic dynamic very much like the First World War, where you cannot move forward in large numbers with the element of surprise, because these pieces of equipment can tell what's going on. They can map the front line and all the movements, and Russia has that capability. It seems to play much more towards an attritional defensive warfare, but also he's made the point clearly that the right scale and types of munitions were not provided in a timely fashion, and therefore allowed Russia to build up these three lines of defenses and prevent really further movement after the rapid taking of Kherson and the region there. Let's tackle that article first, because I think that kind of truth to power from someone as competent as Zaluzhny is interesting. Then we'll turn to the Time article, which I think has a very different kind of tone and purpose. But let's deal with Zaluzhny first.
Interesting that both of these articles have come out when they did. I don't think that was a coincidence. And then you have to think through who are the audiences for each of these. Who's he really speaking to? These were not just casual conversations, either by General Zaluzhny or President Zelensky. I was really impressed with General Zaluzhny's professional, clear, sober assessment of where they are. There was no finger pointing. There was no blame. There was no defeatist kind of attitude. This was the assessment of a very well-educated, experienced professional soldier. I did not walk away from reading that, or I did not come away from reading that article thinking, oh man, this is really going bad. Instead, he laid out what's needed to win. He talked about Crimea as the decisive terrain. He talked about, because of technological changes in what both sides have now, we have got to this sort of positional situation as in the First World War. How remarkable is that Russia, with 3 times the population, all the resources in the world, every single advantage, air superiority, that the Russians are not able to do any more than they've done. The Russians have not destroyed a single convoy or train in 2 years, bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland into Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet is departing Crimea because of what Ukraine is able to do, even though Ukraine does not have a navy, so to speak. So I think what he's, of course, addressing is the fact that Russia does have, and to their credit, the Russians have increased their ability to dominate airspace with drones. And with their traditionally thick air defenses, it's going to be a long time before you see Ukrainian Air Force aircraft in the skies moving freely, that sort of thing. So how do you counter that? Well, you have to counter that with long-range precision strike capability that allows you to penetrate air defenses and hit headquarters and logistics. And so he lays that out. And he also lays out, I think, clearly the need for some way to counter this Russian drone capability that gives the Russians an unblinking eye over everything that Ukraine does. And so, there probably is a combination of technologies, kinetic and non-kinetic, as well as tactics and deception, for at least for periods of time where Ukraine can mitigate or neutralize that Russian capability. That's where he needs some help. I think he correctly states that part of the reason that Russia's defenses are so strong where they are is because we, the West, waited so long to make decisions about providing things. And so the Russians, despite all their problems, were not so stupid as to waste the time that we gave them. I was also impressed that he addressed a question that probably was a little bit uncomfortable, is the fact that there are thousands of Ukrainian military-age males that are avoiding conscription. I mean, what we all saw and felt about the Ukrainian population in the first year, they're fighting for, they're human too. We had people in the U.S. avoiding the draft, especially during Vietnam, but even before Vietnam, and people would avoid service. I think Ukraine is going to have to tighten that up. They need, as this war continues, they're probably going to do more to increase the opportunities for women to serve, just as the United States has done, because we don't have enough males ourselves to do everything. And frankly, there are thousands of military-age males, Ukrainians, that are in Poland, Romania, and Germany that need to return home to Ukraine. And he addressed that. I was impressed with that.
Well, let's turn to the other article, which is very different in tone. I think it's interesting that you make that connection that actually there's a strategy and coordination behind this. But this, of course, is the Simon Schuster article in Time. It has, like no other piece of journalism recently, divided, it seems to me, the Ukrainian community or pro-Ukrainian community on Twitter and other spheres, with many forward in the article saying that it addresses uncomfortable truths, and this is important. However, for me, the problem, the framing of the narrative is somewhat problematic, framing it as the struggle of a lonely individual leader through a sort of great man narrative. And there's an overall tone in the article of defeatism. Now, having been to Ukraine in August and seen the direct impact there, walking through the military cemetery in Lviv, visiting the Superhumans Rehabilitation Center, and seeing many, many people with multiple losses of limbs, I expected to feel a certain defeatism. I expected it to be incredibly depressing and hard-hitting. It was quite the reverse. There's an extraordinary resilience and unity there, like nothing else. And of course, the tragedy and pain of it is also very raw, but there is an absolute determination amongst every single Ukrainian I met for a full and expansive victory. So it seems to me that this article does not reflect the reality of the country and does not reflect the mood on the ground. It leads me to question what the purpose of that narrative is. And as you said earlier, who is the audience for that particular framing?
Yeah. I thought that it was not necessarily helpful in my sense of my interactions with Ukrainians in person as well as virtually, and reading, and like you focused on all of this. There is not a defeatist attitude. Of course, they are tired. Of course, they are concerned about the loss of probably more than 70,000 killed Ukrainians. So they worry about future generations, as does every nation that loses a lot of soldiers in wartime. But I never got a defeatist sort of attitude or a sense of like, okay, we can't just keep doing this. In fact, most people I talk to, when I ask, they'll say, President Zelensky has no intention of stopping, and if he did, he would be out of office very quickly. So I think that President Zelensky, who's been a brilliant strategic communicator from day one, from that first day he stood out with his phone in the street in Kyiv in February last year, maybe having a guy follow you around all the time and seeing your humanness, maybe we'll look back and that was a mistake. General McChrystal made the same mistake, allowed a Rolling Stone journalist to hang out with them for too long, and I don't know that they're getting the effect out of this that they want, or perhaps the combination of the two, they complement each other. And look, my favorite president is Abraham Lincoln. He was the American president from before the Civil War, when our American Civil War started, and he was reelected during the war, and he had nothing but bad news for 3 years. I mean, there was almost nothing but defeat after defeat after defeat, huge casualties, and he's trying to keep the nation together. But he was able to persevere through that, keep the country together. But that doesn't mean he was always upbeat. But I think this is probably where President Zelensky is.
And another aspect of the media, I think, that we've discussed before is the general impatience. I think last time we compared it to, the newspapers after D-Day. We think of, the Normandy landings and the invasion of Europe that followed as being an extraordinary triumph. But at the time, it seemed to be going slowly, and certainly the outcomes seemed to be in the balance. And the media are extremely impatient, as they are now. that also, it seems to me, is an unfair framing of what's going on, because what also emerges from Zaluzhny's article and the sort of strategic thinking is that the preservation of life is not just part of the preparation. It's not just a sort of, a bullet point. It is the core of the Ukrainian strategy, is the preservation of Ukrainian lives, and a conscious decision that this is going to take a lot longer. It's going to require a lot more remote drone warfare. It's going to require a lot more clever strategies. But we're going to do this because we're not willing to waste Ukrainian lives unnecessarily. We're not going to follow the Russian strategy. What's your take on this? Can you imagine there being these sort of conversations taking place and this conscious choice of a longer war versus a shorter one, but with much, much higher casualty rates?
So, as usual, a very good, provocative, and multifaceted question and point. The Ukrainians know what happens to their citizens who are left behind or who live in towns and villages that are occupied by the Russians. They know what happens to people in their country almost every day as Russians launch missiles and rockets against civilian targets. So it has to weigh on the mind and on the heart of President Zelensky and all of the Ukrainian leaders, that every day they lose people. And so the determination to defeat Russia is so strong, however long it takes. Now, the fact that it's taking so long, I put a lot of the blame on us, the West, because we did not decide immediately that it was in our interest to help Ukraine be successful and deliver things that they needed. And we still are slow on getting things to them. Here we are, it's almost 2 years into the war, and the 31 U.S. Abrams tanks are just now finally arrived with trained crews. I mean, almost 2 years to provide a battalion of Abrams tanks. I mean, that's an indicator. It'll be late next spring or in the summer before the F-16s are going to be employed in a meaningful, significant, effective way. So these kind of things have drugged this out. Now, the opening part of your comment, I agree completely, is that the media and all of us are so impatient. We feel entitled to know what's going on. When's the attack happening? As if it's the opening of a football match. And so much video is out there. So many people are able to see and watch what's happening that it can, especially if you live in the comfort of your home, many, many miles away from Ukraine, this kind of has a video game texture to it. This is no game, but there are people that are able to say, why don't they do this? I mean, I read things all the time as you do. Why don't they go here instead of there? I mean, it's maddening. So the Ukraine, General Zaluzhny, I'm sure sometimes he was like, oh my God. But he's able to block a lot of that out. But think about what's happened over the last 4 weeks in Israel. I get asked by media all the time, when's the ground offensive going to start into Gaza? I'm like, what? I mean, the Israelis are not going to, advertise, okay, kickoff is at 5 p.m. I mean, but there's an expectation of a big thing that's going to happen when in fact the Israelis had already begun to infiltrate Gaza. So, but this is the way it is. I mean, this is the nature of the media environment. And so all of us have to, you deal with it. And in fact, you look for opportunities to take advantage of it. How can you be effective in your messaging, be faster than the other side, get the truth out, get your narrative out?
And this leads to a bigger conversation about the global picture. And again, this is perhaps going to be a tough, contentious area, but there seems to be a tendency in both the media and perhaps as a feedback loop with politicians to actually see this war as a local war involving a regional power, Russia. And that is to ignore what clearly is emerging, that this is a gambit for global influence. Now, during the Cold War, we saw Russia as a malign global influence. When there was the concept of dominoes falling and Russia trying to extend its influence around the world. There are signs of this right now and have been for a number of years. Do you worry that we seem to be looking at this as a sort of contained problem rather than one that could spill out or is spilling out right around the world?
Well, Jonathan, what's happening in Ukraine is not just about Ukraine. That this conflict is about so much more. It's about security of Europe. It's about security of Central Asia. It's about the Eurasian landmass. I mean, that's kind of what's at stake here. If Russia is successful and allowed to continue doing what they're doing, working with their Iranian allies, getting ammunition from their North Korean ally, getting some support from China, although not as much as perhaps Russia might have expected. I think that we should be looking at this in a global context, not as a regional or local sort of a conflict, exactly as you've highlighted. The Chinese are watching all of this. They're watching to see, can the West, the United States, the UK, other European countries, and Canada, are we really committed to defending what we say is important, which is respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for human rights, respect for international agreements, the so-called international rules-based order? Are we really serious about defending that? Because if we're not, that is something that the Chinese will see and understand. And then, do we have the capacity? I mean, are we able and willing to convert our industry back to where it needs to be to produce the stuff, the equipment, the ammunition, the capabilities required to help Ukraine defeat Russia, not just survive, but defeat Russia, to help Israel defeat Hamas, to deter Iran from continued attacks and aggression against its neighbors, and still have the ability to tell the Chinese, do not make the terrible miscalculation that you think you could seize islands in the South Pacific or threaten us or our allies or seize Taiwan. That's what's at stake here. And so I think the president is trying to get us all organized, strengthening alliances, not just NATO, but also our relationships in the Indo-Pacific region. You saw he recently hosted the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea at Camp David. I mean, these are not guys that normally hang out with each other. So the president is working with allies to stitch these things together. We have to get organized. We're not there yet, but what's happening in Ukraine is a part of that.
Another area which perhaps doesn't get the attention it deserves, and here I'm going to ask you to put your human rights hat on, that is the extraordinary normalization of violence that has been taking place in Russia over the last 2 decades, but has certainly accelerated considerably since the full-scale invasion. And along with that normalization of violence, not just by security forces, but normalization within a familial context, various changes to the law that allow, for instance, husbands to beat their wives without prosecution and so on. Along with that comes extraordinary genocidal rhetoric. Now, for those of us who can listen to it in the original Russian, it is deeply, deeply shocking, and the force of those words comes through incredibly strongly. Is this genocidal rhetoric, which is clearly followed up by genocidal actions, are you shocked by the lack of attention and indeed shock that this is getting in the media?
I think that the many people are finally waking up to the realization that Russia is a violent society. Even General Zaluzhny said that he was surprised that the Russians were willing to accept so many casualties here in the year 2023. But it's a reflection of how little value they put on human life, particularly lower class, poorer, or ethnic areas, how little value they put on that. So this is a reflection of this violent society. And this is not a new thing. This goes back centuries, as you know better than me, because of your own study and experience. I think that we in the West have been naive, because there was this sort of romanticized notion that Russia is a great European country, it's a great power, and Lavrov wears nice suits and is at all the different champagne receptions, and that Russian ambassadors and these come across as very elegant people, and you've got very wealthy Russians that spend their holidays in Austria and Switzerland or Bavaria or in the Adriatic, and I mean it's out there, and so there's an inconsistency with what we see. And remember watching the Olympics in the old days, these incredible Soviet skaters and ice skaters, and there was this image. And then when you peel away that veneer and you see this very violent society, no wonder they're out killing innocent people in Bucha or Mariupol, doing the things that they do. And so this is why I think it's important that Russia be actually defeated on the battlefield. This notion that somehow we want to help Ukraine get to a strong negotiating position is a terrible idea. It is a missed opportunity. The world has not seen Russian officers in The Hague for war crimes. Russia needs to go through what Nazi Germany did and what Imperial Japan did, to go through that, to have to reckon with who and what they are. If they're not defeated, then we're just going to have another Putin, people like that, as we've had for the last 5 centuries.
This implies that we need a strategy, not just of containment, but a strategy and a vision for what we want to see Russia become. And that would have to be a systemic change, a transformational change. Do you have the impression that we have either a containment or a transformation strategy, or do we not really have a clearly articulated plan, even at this stage?
For sure, we do not have a transformation strategy. I think people that are in positions of power, unfortunately, are just hoping that the problem goes away, or that they can keep a lid on it because we worry about other things, or we have our own domestic problems, and or they're hoping that Ukraine solves it for them. Probably we have what's closer to a containment, to limit Russia's ability to attack NATO countries, for example. Bad luck for Georgia, bad luck for Moldova, bad luck for Ukraine, bad luck for Syria, and all the other places where Russia is using its malign influence. Bad luck for the Armenians, who obviously were let down by the Russians. I think when I look at what's happening in Israel, this is not a coincidence that Russia's most important and reliable ally, Iran, is doing things that takes pressure off of Russia. It's distracting attention and resources away from Ukraine. So part of ending Iran's ability to do what it's doing in the Middle East starts with defeating Russia.
Let's turn to Putin himself, because another extraordinary part of the news cycle, not so much news cycle, but the Twitter cycle, has been the rumors of Putin's death and all sorts of memes about, his doubles and so on. This kind of absurdity seems to be part and parcel, not just with Russian dictatorship, but with all of them. Do you think Putin is now a weak strongman? What are the implications for that? And the other cheeky question is, do all dictatorships eventually end in farce? I'm thinking here the Armando Iannucci film, Death of Stalin. When does that moment come? And rather than this extraordinary fear we have of catastrophe, rather the Putin regime is going to end in almost certainly some kind of ridiculous scenario.
Yeah, almost never do dictators get to ride off into the sunset and enjoy, a nice, pleasant retirement in their last 5 or 10 years with their grandchildren on their knee, that sort of thing. So I would predict that when Putin does, as all humans do, when he does die, unless he dies of some illness, which is unlikely, given that he's got the best health care probably in Europe, it could be a violent end. I don't know. The U.S., we have a bad record of a regime change, of trying to bring about regime change, so I don't advocate for that. But the rumors that are out there, of course, there are a lot of people that hope he is not long for this world, but he's not there just because of himself. I mean, he is kept in power by a lot of people that benefit from his power, and there are a lot of Russians that either don't care or tolerate or are resigned to whoever's in power. And so Russia's still going to have to be defeated, whether or not Vladimir Putin is still in power. But I think and hope that the collective we are thinking strategically and communicating to all these people around Putin, saying, look, there are no bright lights on Russia's horizon. The only hope that Russia has is for the West to give up. So if we make it clear that we're not giving up, that we're committed to helping Ukraine defeat Russia, and these people around Putin realize that they're never going to get back to their flat in Belgravia. They're never going to get their yacht out of impoundment in Italy. They're never going to be able to see their mistress again on the Adriatic coast, or go skiing in Zermatt anymore. Then they start thinking, okay, we've lost too much.
Putin, his demise is inevitable, as you say. He's mortal, like everybody. But Putinism may well survive his demise. And at the moment, there seems to be an extraordinary change in the Russian economy. They've tooled up the factories to try and turn it into a war economy. They have come up with all sorts of clever schemes that mean that oil revenues have actually started to rebound, and that sanctions are working less and less well. And clearly, they've created a system whereby it's a small minority, but a minority of people are getting rich on the war economy. And the propaganda information space feeds on the idea of a forever war. And the nominal announcement next year is that the military budget is rising by 70%. That's the announced rate. It's likely that behind the scenes, it's far, far greater, with many more projects that are unannounced, that are related to military. And of course, they'll be paying over the odds for Iranian drones, North Korean shells, etc. What is the risk here, you think, that this war economy could out-survive Putin?
Well, I guess that's a possibility, but you caused me to think about 3 or 4 things. First of all, I don't trust any number that comes out of there. Any number that's released by the Russian government is released for a purpose. So I would trust intelligence agencies and real economists to be able to peel back and say, okay, this is probably not true, or it's based on certain assumptions, like most economic forecasts. So I'm skeptical of the numbers, first and foremost. Secondly, a percentage increase of the Russian economy is still not so significant. I had so many people tell me before February last year, come on, Ben, the Russians are not going to attack. I mean, their economy is the size of Italy. So, I mean, I heard that over and over. So, when you start talking about percentage of what, I think has to be taken into account. I have read where Putin was complaining that there's not enough people to work in defense industry. Well, no kidding, because they're all getting killed in Ukraine. And so they've got a labor problem that they're either going to have to put more women in to do things that men are doing, or they're going to figure out how to retool their economy to do that. The North Korean ammunition, I would really like to have an unbiased expert tell me about the quality of that ammunition. As you know, ammunition, explosive materials, these are not like hammers where they can just sit on the shelf forever. I mean, there is a shelf life literally for ammunition. It has to be properly stored and handled. So I'd like to know, of the 1 million rounds supposedly that have been delivered or are being delivered, how'd you get that number? I'm very skeptical of the number. I've read analysis of this number is based on number of rail cars that were used to deliver it. And when you compare that to how Russians normally ship things, I'm very skeptical of the numbers and then of the quality of the number. But finally, you hit on one of the most important points. You know, the U.S. talked about sanctions before February last year, and that the Russians were going to face sanctions, quote, like they've never seen before. And they have. There have been a lot of sanctions. There have been positive effects or negative effects, if you're from a Russian perspective, particularly on their ability to make long-range precision strike weapons. The quality is clearly decreased. But there are too many holes in the system. There's too many ways for them to bypass. I was in Georgia, in Tbilisi, back in early September, and I was astounded at the number of Russian cars I saw, the trucks from Armenia. There is a significant bypass of sanctions going on. There, you've got ships that are moving things from stolen grain, oil and gas, from Crimea, which should be illegal, moving through the Black Sea, ships turning off their transponders, and then they appear magically somewhere else. So closing all these things. I have to say, I was surprised yesterday. I read that the United States had imposed another 150, either they hit 150 targets with sanctions or something else. I'm like, what? I couldn't believe there were that many things still not yet under sanction. So we've got to do a lot better with our economic tools.
And as the war goes on and on, we're approaching the second anniversary, and unfortunately, it's highly likely that unless there's some kind of black swan type event or some extraordinary Budanov, pulling a rabbit out of a hat kind of thing, it's highly likely the war will still be continuing in February. Ironically, as it proceeds, more and more lives are lost, more and more buildings and infrastructure are destroyed. Does it actually become less likely over time that Ukraine will receive adequate compensation when the war is over? Because the sheer scale of loss and destruction is just increasing month on month on month.
So I worry that if the conflict ends in some sort of a settlement where Russia is still in control of Crimea, for example, or is still capable of launching new attacks. I mean, I spoke with a very, very, very senior international investment firm leader back at the Munich Security Conference last February, and he said, they will be very reluctant to invest a lot of money in the rebuilding of Ukraine if they see that conflict is likely to continue or to break out. So that is, and that makes sense. I mean, who would invest in something when the Russians are going to blow it up in the next year or two? And then Russia's ability to block access into Azov Sea or to disrupt traffic in and out of the 3 Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea, that will make it very difficult for them to rebuild their economy, which means not only will there be continued interruption of grain to the world, which affects food prices even in places like the UK, but it also means that millions of Ukrainian refugees will not have something to which they can return. So that exacerbates the refugee problem that European countries like Germany and Poland and Romania are having to handle.
And this really is the last question area, because I know we're approaching the sort of end, and it's going to be one of your favorite multi-pronged ones, I'm afraid. So the territories that are occupied by Russia have been subject to extraordinary devastation, terror, torture, murder. There are more and more stories coming out, and a very powerful thread on Twitter by Volodymyr Ermolenko, who's been visiting some of the formerly occupied territories. A pattern absolutely emerges of all these extraordinary illegality that rules in the occupied territories, and extraordinary inhumanity. What, therefore, must the scope and scale of war crimes processes be after the war, even if they're carried on in absentia? And the tricky question here, as these losses, as this extraordinary litany of crimes gets greater and greater and greater, is there a risk that these cease to become lives, individuals, but they turn into statistics? And the result of that is that actually we can no longer think in a humane, rational way about them.
I guess there is that risk, but I mean, it didn't happen after World War II. We still carried on with the Nuremberg trials, and then the trials of the leaders of Imperial Japan, here in Germany, you still, about once a year, you'll hear about some 94-year-old former guard from a concentration camp was turned up, and so that continues. And I listened to Mr. Habeck, who is not only is he the leader of the Green Party here in Germany, he's also the economics minister, and he's the vice chancellor of Germany. And you probably saw it. He gave this amazing speech a couple of days ago about anti-Semitism and that has been exposed and has all over Europe, and particularly in Germany. And he talked about how 80 years after the Holocaust. I mean, it was a very compelling. It's the best speech I've ever heard by any German politician about what's at stake and how important this is. And so here in Germany, you can be sure they have not lost sight of this, and the fact that it hadn't been destroyed. The idea of of anti-Semitism has not been destroyed. It's still out there, and it's been exposed in the U.S. and U.K. and France and others as well. So I think that The Hague, the International Criminal Court, is an institution that is working very hard on cataloging these things. I think there will be other tribunals that will need to be established that have the right jurisdiction. Otherwise, I don't want to hear anybody complaining or say never again if you're not willing to actually make sure it never happens again. And I would say that the United States needs to ratify the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court and be a full-fledged part of it as well, if we are serious about these things.
And I think we've mentioned this before. You would include in that not just those who are giving criminal orders and executing criminal orders, but also the class of propagandists who are inciting this extraordinary genocidal rhetoric day in, day out.
Yeah, for sure. They are enablers. Just like, by the way, we have enablers in the United States that say things and do things and that are interpreted as approval of violence against political targets. This is a very, very powerful force that's out there, and it's given wings by social media, where everybody can get on their phone or their laptop and say the most outrageous things, and that spreads so fast. So I think the enablers of that sort of violence need to be held accountable, as are the people who actually give the order for missiles to hit civilian targets or soldiers who actually pull the trigger.
Well, Ben, it's been a huge privilege talking to you once again. It always gives me optimism and hope that a Ukrainian victory is possible. And I think that, rather than defeatism, is incredibly important at this time. Thank you so much for talking to the channel and sharing your incisive views with us.
Well, Jonathan, your program is one of my favorites because, first of all, the quality of the questions you ask, the depth of knowledge and understanding you already have, and you give me the opportunity to try to think through these things. So I appreciate the opportunity.